Hello everyone, my name's Scott. Thanks for joining me this morning. As I'm in this kind of jungle location, I'm reminded of the movie Indiana Jones, specifically one scene where Harrison Ford's character is about to walk across this chasm with the idea that he needs to take a step of faith. And sometimes life can feel like that, where it's a blind step of faith that we just have to walk into whatever the future holds for us, and we're just trying not to die in some crazy chasm. But I believe that Jesus gives us a little more than having to take a blind step. I believe that he invites us into a place of trusting him, of relationship, and especially with everything happening in culture, trusting Jesus is something I think we could all use a little bit of practice on. As Pastor Chap was speaking on Sunday, one verse in particular kind of stood out in a way that it hasn't in the past. It was Ephesians 1, verse 7. I'll read it for you. It says, "In him," referring to Christ, "in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace." In him we have redemption. That's a concept that we've talked about a lot in terms of the Christian life, that we have redemption through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But this verse hit me a little differently this week because I paired that with a philosopher that I heard. His name is Jordan Peterson. He was talking about what it is to fear God. And he had this image that I thought was rather fascinating. And he said, think of this rope as the continuum of your life. And on this continuum, you have events that happen every day in everyday moments. But when sin comes into our world, when sin hits our life, it disrupts the flow of our life rhythm. Now, what happens is sometimes people feel like, well, whatever sin I can get away with, or it may not be such a big deal. But we see all throughout the Old Testament that God is a God of justice. And we see that whenever sin interrupts the fabric of reality, well, it causes rippling effects. And we may not notice it in the moment or in the hour, in the day or the months, but eventually we'll get later on down the continuum and we'll see that life isn't adding up the way we thought it should. And if we trace back that continuum, we'll notice that there is a rift in the fabric of reality that is causing a distortion in the way that our life should be. And that's a really philosophical way of saying that when it comes to sin, it really destroys everything that God had created. In Genesis 1, we were created to be his image bearers, and when sin comes into the world, it destroys that. And so here we have Jesus restoring reality. Our reality with him through us trusting in his lordship. And that's something different because all throughout human history, before Jesus and Yahweh, before that scenario comes onto the scene, it is about appeasing the gods and pleasing gods. And here we have Jesus saying, no, it's not about doing something for me. It's not about performing. It's not about being good enough. It is about trusting me who was good enough. And when we place our trust in him, that grace that he extends to us, that is the perfect balance of mercy and justice, is that which gives us life. And now it's not about a cheap grace. This guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer says when we take grace flippantly and we just continue to repeat the same mistakes without a heart of repentance, that's cheap grace. But the grace that's talked about here in verse 7 is this amazing, bountiful grace. The forgiveness of our sin happens according to the riches of God's grace. According to the riches. I've never seen this verse like that before. That God's grace isn't with limits, but it is full of riches. We cannot spend the amount of grace he has to offer because of how good he is. And that's not an excuse to make it cheap. It's rather an acknowledgement of how vast God's grace extends. And perhaps this week you need to be reminded that God's grace for you is bountiful. And perhaps you need to be reminded that when we walk in God's grace, instead of the fear and the lies that the enemy would try to bring, that you're not good enough, that you can't, or that your anxieties and worries should shut you down, God's grace is sufficient for you as it is sufficient for me. And that gives me hope that today doesn't have to be marked by my past dysfunction, but today can be marked by my identity as a son or as a daughter of the King. I would encourage you, what does God's grace look like for you this week? Extending it to either yourself for whatever circumstances you're going through, or recognizing that the grace God has given you is not meant just for you, but meant for you to bring hope to others who need it, who need to be transformed by this message of hope that Jesus brings. May we all remember his grace this week And may we remember it in a way that's not just for our own transformation, but in a way where we may share it with those around us so that they too may be inspired by the hope that comes in Jesus. Have a great week.